Before we begin, write in the comments where you are watching from. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell. Let us continue. 400 shekels of silver. That was the price Abraham paid for a piece of land in Canaan almost 4,000 years ago. It was not to build a house, it was not to plant, it was to bury his wife Sarah. And here is the detail that changes everything. This plot still exists. The cave he bought is still there, and the bodies of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and their wives remain in the same place until today. Think of the absurdity of this statement. We are speaking of a period prior to the pyramids of Giza, prior to the foundation of Rome by more than 1,000 years, prior to the Trojan War. Most civilizations of that time did not leave even recognizable ruins. The Hittites, with whom Abraham negotiated the purchase of the land, disappeared from history for so long that scholars came to doubt their existence. Entire empires turned to dust. Cities that one day dominated the ancient world today are merely layers of earth waiting for archaeologists. But that cave, in Hebron, bought by a nomad without a homeland, remains. The transaction is recorded in chapter 23 of Genesis with a precision that impresses historians. Abraham refuses to accept the land for free. He insists on paying the full value. 400 shekels of silver, weighed publicly in the presence of witnesses. The Ugaritic texts discovered in the 20th century revealed that this was a standard price for real estate transactions in Canaan at that time. The biblical record was not inventing numbers. And why such insistence on buying legally? Because Abraham knew something that many of us have forgotten. He knew he was planting a seed for the future. That piece of land would be the first documented property of his family in the Promised Land, the first of many, or at least that was the promise. The cave is called Machpelah. The word means double in Hebrew, probably because it consists of two connected chambers. It is located in the city of Hebron, 30 kilometers south of Jerusalem. And what makes this place truly extraordinary is not just its antiquity, but its continuity. Unlike almost all other sites of the ancient world, the location was never lost. It was never forgotten. It never needed to be rediscovered. Sarah was the first to be buried there. The Bible records that she died at 127 years, being the only woman in the scriptures whose exact age of death is mentioned. Abraham mourned his wife and then rose to negotiate the land. The text suggests he did not waste time. There was urgency. There was purpose. Decades later, Abraham himself was buried in the same cave. The text of Genesis 25 records that his sons Isaac and Ishmael performed the burial together. The two half-brothers, whose lineages would become rivals throughout the following millennia, were there side by side at that moment, both honoring the father, both recognizing the importance of that place. Isaac and his wife Rebekah were also buried in Machpelah, and after them, Jacob and his wife Leah. 6 bodies in total, 3 generations of patriarchs and matriarchs, the founders of what would become the people of Israel. The case of Jacob deserves special attention. He died in Egypt, where he had established himself with his family during a great famine. Before dying, he made his son Joseph swear that he would take his mortal remains back to Canaan and bury them in the cave of Machpelah. Chapter 50 of Genesis describes the fulfillment of this promise. Joseph embalmed his father's body following Egyptian customs, a process that took 40 days. Then he organized a funeral caravan that included not only all of Jacob's family, but also Egyptian dignitaries, chariots and horsemen. It was a procession of unprecedented size and pomp. Consider what this means. A man who lived as a foreigner in various lands, who spent a good part of his life fleeing or negotiating or simply surviving, made an absolute point of being buried in that specific piece of land. Not anywhere in Canaan, not in a convenient location, but specifically in the cave that his grandfather had bought. The faith of that family was literally buried in that place. 2,000 years after the original purchase, King Herod built a monumental structure over the cave. The Herodian walls that surround the site are approximately 60 meters long by 35 meters wide. The walls are almost 2 meters thick and rise to a height of 12 meters. To have an idea of the scale, imagine a 4-story building made entirely of massive stone. blocks some weighing more than 5 tons. The most impressive thing is that this structure is the only Herodian construction that has survived practically intact to this day. The Temple of Jerusalem, Herod's masterpiece, was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70. Masada fell. Caesarea Maritima is in ruins, but the walls around the cave of Machpelah remain standing exactly as they were built. The construction technique is identical to that used on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Limestone blocks cut with millimeter precision, with beveled edges characteristic of the Herodian style. Without mortar, only the weight and the perfect cut, keeping everything in place. 2 millennia of earthquakes, wars and occupations failed to bring down these walls. No one entered the underground caves for centuries. The Muslim rulers who controlled the site from the 7th century onwards forbade any access to the lower chambers. The area above the caves was converted into a mosque, with decorative cenotaphs marking the approximate position of each tomb beneath. Jews were forbidden to enter the entire building. For centuries, the most they could do was climb 7 steps of an external staircase and pray from there. 7 steps. That was the limit. In 1967, Israel captured Hebron during the Six-Day War. For the first time in 700 years, Jews could enter the building and pray next to the tombs of their ancestors. But the underground caves remained a mystery. No one was sure of what was down there. A year later, the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, who was also an amateur archaeologist, decided to investigate. He knew there was a small opening in the floor of the Hall of Isaac, through which candles were traditionally lowered toward the caves. The opening was only 28 centimeters in diameter, less than 30 centimeters. No adult could pass through. Dayan found an unusual solution. Michal Arbel, a 12-year-old girl, daughter of the chief of operations of the Israeli Security Service in the West Bank, was thin enough to pass through the opening. In October of 1968, she was lowered into the cave with a flashlight and a camera. Michal described what she saw: a narrow staircase leading to corridors and chambers, Herodian stone walls, and pottery fragments dating from the First Temple period, more than 2,500 years ago. She did not reach the deeper chambers where the bodies supposedly rest, but she confirmed that the caves existed and that they contained traces of very ancient veneration. Some years later, a group of young students from a religious school in Hebron managed a more complete exploration. They entered through a different passage, wider, known as Serdab. They found corridors leading to underground chambers. They found bones, which they believed to be of people buried there over the centuries, as a way of honoring the sacred site. And they found pottery dated to the era of the kings of Judah, but they never reached the deepest chambers. An ancient Jewish tradition states that everyone who tried to descend to the lowest chambers never returned. Only one person is said to have managed to enter and leave alive, Rabbi Abraham Azulai, about 300 years ago. According to the story, the Turkish Sultan had dropped his sword into the cave, and several soldiers sent to retrieve it died in the process. Rabbi Azulai managed to descend, retrieve the sword, and return safely. Legend or not, the fact remains. The deepest caves of Machpelah were never completely explored or documented by modern archaeology. The bodies are there, but no one has seen them, and perhaps it is better that way. While Machpelah guards the remains of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there is a matriarch missing. Rachel, Jacob's most beloved wife, is not buried in Hebron. She died on the way, literally on the way. Chapter 35 of Genesis tells the story. Jacob was traveling with his family from Bethel to Ephrath when Rachel went into labor. It was a difficult birth, complicated. The midwife tried to encourage her, saying it would be another boy. But Rachel was dying and knew it. With her last strength, she gave a name to the son, Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow. Jacob changed the name to Benjamin, son of my right hand, and then Rachel died. Jacob buried her right there, by the roadside. He did not take her to Machpelah, where Sarah and Rebekah were already buried. He did not take her to any city. He just erected a pillar over her tomb at the exact spot where she fell. Why not take her to Hebron? The distance was not so great, just a few kilometers. Biblical commentators have debated this question for millennia. Some traditions suggest that Jacob was ashamed to present himself before his ancestors, having married two sisters, something forbidden by the law that would later be given to Moses. Other traditions say it was the divine will, but there is a deeper explanation recorded in ancient rabbinic sources. Jacob knew by revelation or intuition that one day his descendants would pass by that exact spot on their way to exile, and when they passed, they would need someone there to weep for them. Rachel would be that presence. The prophet Jeremiah, centuries later, gave voice to this image. A voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel, weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. The mother buried by the roadside, weeping for her descendants as they marched into Babylonian captivity. Rachel's tomb is today at the northern entrance of Bethlehem, about 2 kilometers south of Jerusalem. The current structure is small, with about 7 meters on each side and walls 6 meters high, crowned by a 3-meter dome. It is not an ancient construction. The current building dates from the Ottoman period, probably from the 15th century. But the location is the same that pilgrims have described since the 4th century, of the Christian era. Unlike Machpelah, which is a grandiose monument, Rachel's tomb has always been modest, a simple structure by the roadside, exactly as Jacob left it. Over the centuries, the place became especially important for women seeking to have children. The irony is poignant. Rachel, who suffered so much with infertility before finally conceiving Joseph, became the patron saint of women facing the same pain. They go to her tomb and pray. They tie red ribbons on the monument. They cry their tears together with hers. Today, the tomb is surrounded by concrete walls almost 5 meters high. Security barriers, watchtowers and barbed wire have transformed the site into a fortress. Armored buses take pilgrims along the protected road to the enclosed complex. The mother, who was left by the roadside to comfort travelers, can now only be reached through military checkpoints. The times have changed. The pain remains. Joseph's tomb presents a different story. He died in Egypt, where he had become the second most powerful man in the empire. The pharaoh honored him. The people venerated him. He had everything a man could desire in that sophisticated civilization. But Joseph did not want to be buried there. Before dying at 110 years, Joseph made his brothers swear that they would take his bones back to Canaan when God finally visited the people and took them out of Egypt. The text of Genesis 50 records his words, "God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here." Joseph was embalmed and placed in a coffin in Egypt, and there he stayed for 400 years. 400 years is a long time. Entire civilizations are born and die in 400 years. The United States has not existed for 400 years. Brazil as a nation is little more than 500. During this entire period, Joseph's bones remained in Egypt, waiting. When Moses finally led the Exodus, he did not forget the promise. The book of Exodus, chapter 13, specifically mentions that Moses took with him the bones of Joseph. Amidst all the urgencies of the flight, amidst the plagues and the crossing of the sea and the pillar of fire, someone remembered to carry that coffin. The bones traveled through the desert for 40 years. They crossed the Jordan with Joshua, and finally were buried in Shechem, in the portion of land that Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor for 100 pieces of money. Observe the pattern. Abraham bought land to bury Sarah. Jacob bought land in Shechem. Generations later, the descendants returned to use these properties exactly as intended. Faith operated on timescales that we, with our mentality of instant gratification, can barely comprehend. Joseph's tomb is today on the outskirts of Nablus, the city that occupies the site of ancient Shechem. It is about 300 meters from Jacob's well, another biblical site that has survived to the present day. Between Mount Gerizim and Ebal, exactly where the book of Joshua says it should be. The Israeli archaeologist Zvi Ilan described Joseph's tomb as one of the tombs whose location is known with the highest degree of certainty based on continuous documentation since biblical times. Unlike many holy sites that were identified late by Christian or Muslim traditions, this one was always known. Samaritans, Jews, Christians and Muslims agreed on its location. The current structure is not ancient. The building that exists today dates from the 19th century, with a rectangular courtyard and a small domed chamber containing a stone memorial, but the location remained consistent through the millennia. Unfortunately, Joseph's tomb became one of the most disputed sites of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In October of 2000, during the Second Intifada, a crowd destroyed the site hours after Israeli forces withdrew. Holy books were burned, the structure was damaged, the site was vandalized again in 2015 and in 2022. Today, Jews can only visit the tomb on special occasions, at night under heavy military escort. A place that for millennia was accessible to pilgrims of all religions now requires complex security operations to be reached. The bones that Moses carried through the desert for 40 years rest in a place surrounded by tension and violence. Joseph, who reconciled his brothers and saved his family from famine, lies in a place where reconciliation seems impossible. The story continues. The pain, too. There is a patriarch whose tomb no one has ever found, and that was intentional. Moses died on Mount Nebo, in the land of Moab, on the other side of the Jordan, looking at the promised land that he could not enter. Chapter 34 of Deuteronomy describes his last moments. God showed him all the land from Gilead to Dan, all the territory of Naphtali, Ephraim, Manasseh, Judah as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees as far as Zoar. A panoramic view of everything that had been promised, everything he had worked to achieve during 40 years in the desert, everything that would never be his. And then Moses died. At 120 years, with eyes still good and vigor still intact. The following verse is extraordinary. And he buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day. Who buried him? The Hebrew text is ambiguous. Many understand that it was God himself, the greatest prophet of Israel, buried personally by the Creator, in a place that no one would ever know. Why hide the tomb? Jewish tradition offers a pragmatic explanation. The Israelites had a dangerous tendency toward idolatry. If they knew where Moses was buried, they could transform the place into an object of worship. They could venerate the man instead of God. They could lose sight of what really mattered, so God hid the body, not only buried it, but hid it, so completely that in more than 3,000 years, despite countless searches, no one has ever found it. An ancient midrash tells that the Roman emperor sent 2 detachments of soldiers to search for the tomb. One group went to the mountains, another to the valley. Those who were in the mountains looked down and saw the tomb in the valley. Those who were in the valley looked up and saw the tomb in the mountains. When they divided and searched in both places simultaneously, those above saw the tomb below, and those below saw the tomb above. The tomb that exists and does not exist, that is everywhere and nowhere. Christian pilgrims of the 4th century identified Mount Nebo as the site of Moses' death. A church was built there, later expanded into a monastery. The Franciscans have cared for the site since 1932. Excavations revealed an empty tomb under the mosaic floor of the basilica. The medieval monks believed that this was the memorial of Moses. But no one claims to have found the mortal remains. The tomb, if it exists physically, remains hidden, exactly as God wanted. There is a deep irony here. Moses spent his life trying to lead his people to the promised land, but he himself stayed outside. His body remains on the other side of the Jordan, forever looking at what he could not reach. And yet, Moses eventually entered the promised land. 1,500 years after his death, he appeared on the Mount of Transfiguration together with Elijah, speaking with Jesus. The evangelist Luke records that they were talking about the departure that Jesus was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. The man who never crossed the Jordan in life finally stepped on the promised land in glory. David's tomb presents the opposite problem. Everyone knows where it is. Millions of people visit the site every year. The problem is that it is probably not the right place. The book of 1 Kings states clearly, David rested with his fathers and was buried in the city of David. The city of David was the narrow ridge south of the Temple Mount, the original Jerusalem that David conquered from the Jebusites, a relatively small area with perhaps 15 acres perched over the Kidron Valley. but the site venerated today as David's tomb is on Mount Zion on the other side of the valley, in a completely different direction. How did this confusion happen? Part of the answer lies in the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans in the year 70. The city was razed so completely that many locations were lost. When Hadrian rebuilt the city as Aelia Capitolina decades later, the geography had changed. The name Mount Zion, which originally referred to the ridge where the city of David was gradually transferred to the higher hill to the west. In the 9th century, Muslim geographers began to identify the current site as David's tomb. In the 12th century, the Crusaders built the cenotaph that exists to this day, a stone sarcophagus covered with velvet, in a room of a medieval building. The tradition consolidated. Jews, Christians, and Muslims came to venerate the site. But the sarcophagus is empty. It is a memorial, not a real tomb. Archaeological excavations in the true city of David, south of the Temple Mount, did not find the original tomb. There are burial caves from the era, but none was conclusively identified as the burial site of the kings of Judah. The Apostle Peter, on the day of Pentecost, said to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, "I can speak to you freely of the patriarch David, that he died and was buried, and his tomb is with us to this day." In the 1st century, people still knew where David was buried. That knowledge was lost at some point in the following centuries. Still, the site on Mount Zion became deeply significant. Between 1948 and 1967, when the old city of Jerusalem was under Jordanian control and Jews could not access the Western Wall, David's tomb was one of the few holy places where they could pray. Generations of Israelis made that place their point of connection with the biblical past. The story does not need to be archaeologically precise to be spiritually true. Observe the full picture. Machpelah in Hebron, with its known and confirmed tombs. Rachel's tomb on the road to Bethlehem, marking the exact place of her death. Joseph in Shechem, fulfilling a promise of 400 years. Moses somewhere in Moab, hidden by God. David in a place that perhaps is not the correct one, but which carries the weight of centuries of devotion. Each of these tombs tells a story about faith, promise, and persistence. Abraham bought land that only his bones would see flourish. Rachel was left by the roadside to comfort future generations. Joseph waited 400 years to return home. Moses died looking at what he could not have. David was buried in a place that was later lost and had to be reinvented. And amidst all these stories, a truth emerges. The holy tombs are not important only for what they contain. They are important for what they represent. They are physical landmarks of spiritual promises. They are proofs that some things last longer than empires. 15 different civilizations have controlled Hebron since Abraham bought that cave. Canaanites, Israelites, Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, Byzantines, Arabs, Crusaders, Mamluks, Ottomans, British, Jordanians, Israelis. Each one left its mark. Each one eventually passed, but the tombs remained. Abraham died without seeing the promised land become his. He passed his entire life as a foreigner, living in tents, without possessing anything other than that cave in Hebron. But that small piece of land was more than a tomb. It was a declaration of faith. By buying Machpelah, Abraham was saying that he believed in the promise, even if only his bones were to witness its fulfillment, and they witnessed. Centuries later, his descendants returned from Egypt and took possession of Canaan. The land he bought to bury Sarah became the first title deed of the people of Israel. Today, Jews, Christians, and Muslims visit this place. 3 religions that together sum more than half of the world population recognize that man as father. 400 shekels of silver, a cave, a wager on eternity. Abraham did not live to see any of this. But faith does not require seeing. It requires trusting. And 4,000 years later, the cave is still there, proving that some promises take time, but they are fulfilled.